Welcome to the CDA Institute's Geopolitical Update. I'm Josh Malm, Director of Research and Analysis for the Institute, and I'm joined by geopolitical expert Joseph Varner, Deputy Director of the Conference of Defense Associations and former Director of Policy for the Minister of National Defense. In this podcast, Joe will provide his analysis and insights on the most significant geopolitical and international security developments of the week. So grab your headphones and get ready for a concise but comprehensive update on the world's most pressing geopolitical issues. The CDA Institute encourages rigorous debate on national security matters through our events, research, and publications. Joe, great to be with you again for the Geopolitical Update. Can you provide our listeners with a brief overview of what's been happening on the global stage this week? What are the key highlights and trends that we should be aware of before we get into more specifics?
Three stories this week that are of particular interest are Russia's squadron of warships sailing to the Caribbean, Moscow's increasingly growing tactical nuclear drills in Europe, and a new twist to China's testing of Taiwan's defenses.
Well, thanks for that, Joe. Why don't we touch on Russia's activity in the Caribbean, which has been a really big story over the past 48 hours or so.
Russia has decided to give the U.S. a direct warning by sending a task group of warships to Cuba as part of Atlantic combat drills. The drills include a Yasin-class nuclear-powered cruise missile submarine, the Kazan, the frigate Admiral Gorshakov, and two support ships. A Russian Navy tug also was pre-positioned in Havana. The cruise missile submarine carries the nuclear-capable 3M-54 caliber and the P-800 Onyx cruise missiles, while the frigate Gorshakov is armed with the Zircon nuclear-capable hypersonic cruise missile that flies at about Mach 9. The warships have fired high-precision missiles at mocked enemy targets from a distance of more than 600 kilometers during the voyage. The Zircon can penetrate existing anti-missile defenses by flying 9 times faster than sound, and at a range of more than 1,000 kilometers, and if used against American targets, could strike major U.S. East Coast cities in under 10 minutes from the waters off the U.S. coast. Needless to say, the U.S. and NATO warships escorted the Russian naval contingent along the trip to Cuba to protect the North American homeland. There are some suggestions that the Russian naval maneuvers had people in Washington as nervous as long-tailed cats in a room full of rocking chairs. The Russian ships are now at anchor in Cuba.
Thanks, Joe. Maybe you could also touch on Russia's tactical nuclear drills as well.
The Putin Caribbean cruise to Cuba coincides with ever-growing Russian tactical nuclear drills. The drills started a couple of weeks ago with the movement of theater-level nuclear systems and tactics in the south of the country, and then this past week moved to Russia and Belarus conducting nuclear war drills. The drills have now moved to the newly established Leningrad military district that borders NATO countries Norway, Finland, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And to date, the U.S. has not seen any worrying changes in Russia's overall nuclear posture, but its activities are concerning. In response to the nuclear drills, NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg on Wednesday highlighted the alliance's efforts to adapt its current capabilities to the new security threats. And Stoltenberg noted that the Netherlands in June declared the first F-35 fighter jets ready to carry nuclear arms and said the U.S. was modernizing its nuclear weapons in Europe.
Thanks for that insight, Joe. Maybe before we close out this week's segment, you could discuss the latest in cross-strait relations.
China considers Taiwan to be a renegade province and has warned that the island and its population either reunify with the communist state or face forced reunification by 2027. Reunification has become President Xi's legacy project, and he has invested enormous political capital in the conquest of the democratic state. The last few years, we have watched China use aircraft and warships to rehearse surprise attacks and blockade drills geared to take Taiwan by force of arms. This week saw a former Chinese People's Liberation Army naval captain drive a speedboat right into the heart of a Taiwanese harbor to test Taiwan's defenses. The boat was only detected by radar about 6 nautical miles from the coast, but the Taiwanese Coast Guard did not know that it was not a Taiwanese boat, so they let it go. A recent military expert warned that the Chinese might use fast attack craft to race up the estuary to the nation's capital and seize it by surprise. And this coincided with Chinese combat aircraft drills, where they crossed the median line in the Strait of Taiwan between the two rival states and only were minutes from being able to strike the presidential palace in a decapitation strike against the island's leadership, rendering the national leadership of Taiwan unable to respond in an attack in time of war.
As we near the end of today's episode, Joe, do you have any parting insights or reflections you'd like to leave our listeners with, or are there any other news stories you think that they should be watching?
So in stories to watch this week, the G7 Leaders Summit in Italy is front of mind as leaders are expected to discuss Russia's Ukraine war, Hamas and Israel, energy security, and AI. And the G7 Summit is being followed by the International Peace Summit on the Ukraine and Switzerland that both Russia and China have tried to turn into a kind of goat rodeo of failure. As well, NATO countries continue to be worried about Russian hybrid warfare and sabotage attacks on Western countries that have raised Moscow's ire with unknown causes of arson, GPS jamming, cyber attacks, disinformation, and potentially disruption of power and energy flow in undersea cables. Dmitry Medvedev, deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council and a former president, called Thursday for Russians to mobilize to inflict maximum harm, quote unquote, on Western societies and infrastructure. And the NATO Secretary General this week said defense ministers meeting in Brussels would discuss plans to counter a Russian campaign of hostile activities against NATO allies, adding that ministers would work on responsive options. Poland, Germany, the UK, and Czech Republic have all reported incidents of hybrid warfare type attacks in recent weeks. Hezbollah fired over 200 rockets at northern Israel on Wednesday, and Israel answers every Hezbollah attack with retaliatory strikes and targeted assassinations of Hezbollah military leaders. Israel has over 100,000 civilians that are displaced from northern communities, and the domestic pressure right now on the Netanyahu government to make the north safe and get them home, and that means to do that safely, they have to strike Hezbollah and move them back. And that pressure is really building on the Netanyahu government. Iran has armed Hezbollah with between 150,000 rockets and missiles that can strike Israel, and they can fire upwards of 4,500 projectiles per day, which will present real challenges to the Jewish state's air defenses and a real threat to the civilian population. And that will put Iran in Israel's crosshairs. Iran is close to being able to field theoretically between 3 and 8 nuclear devices, and they currently are in the run-up to presidential elections where only hardliners have a real chance of winning, including the parliamentary speaker who is a former Revolutionary Guard commander. And finally, I would just say it's worthwhile watching that Iran is currently working to destabilize the Kingdom of Jordan, to remove the king and bring the war to Israel on yet another front. There is a very unhappy expatriate Palestinian refugee population in Jordan that are no fans of Israel and are not fans of the monarchy, and they're being stoked by the fighting in Gaza and Tehran to act out.
Thanks, Joe, for your insight and analysis and for guiding us through this week's geopolitical developments. Once again, to our listeners, thanks for tuning in. Be sure to join us next week as we reconvene with Joe to delve into another week of global affairs. Additionally, next week we'll be relaunching our flagship Expert Series podcast, and I believe we have something really special in store. So make sure to follow our newsletter and subscribe to our YouTube and streaming channels for the latest updates. More to come on Tuesday. Thanks again.